Story 1. The swim everyone believed. In My Name is Robert, and the first thing I noticed when they pulled me onto the rescue boat was that nobody asked if I was hurt. They asked who was missing, and they asked it like they already knew the answer. Hands grabbed my arms and dragged me over the side, and the deck felt wrong under my chest after so many hours holding onto the overturned hull. I tried to sit up and point back at the water, but my throat burned, and when words finally came, I said he swam, he let go, he said he would get help, and the moment I said it, everything went quiet. No one argued with me, no one reacted. They just looked past me and scanned the surface like they were searching for something they had already accepted was gone. They wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and it should have felt like rescue, but it felt like they were covering a mistake. I kept looking at the water because that was the last place he existed. Earlier that day, everything had looked manageable, and that was the problem. The boat was small but stable, and the water near shore looked calm enough to forgive confidence. We told ourselves we were not going far, and that thought followed us longer than it should have. When the engine stopped, it did not explode or stall loudly, it just faded, and the silence after it felt unnatural. Someone tried the cord again and again, and the motor answered with nothing, and we laughed once because laughter can delay fear. While we talked, the boat drifted without asking permission, and by the time we noticed, the shore was no longer something we could point to with certainty. The current was steady and quiet, and that made it dangerous because it did not scare us into acting quickly. The guides stopped pretending first, and when they spoke, their tone changed completely. They did not say we might have a problem, they spoke like the problem had already happened and we were late to it. They pointed toward land and then at the water and made it clear that the swim was possible now and it would not be later. I argued that we should wait, that staying with the boat was safer, and I said it like I was being responsible. He listened without reacting, and that should have warned me because he was already finished with debate. The guides went into the water without ceremony and started swimming with steady, controlled movements that made it look achievable, and that image was dangerous. We watched them grow smaller and then disappear, and the boat felt more fragile the moment they were gone. Time passed, and we tried to convince ourselves we were doing something useful, but nothing we did changed the direction we were moving. The wave that tipped us did not announce itself, it just arrived at the wrong angle and turned everything over in seconds. Water rushed in, and then everything went quiet again because fear sounds different underwater. I surfaced and grabbed the hull and held on because letting go felt like choosing an ending. He surfaced near me, breathing hard but focused, and he moved like someone who refused to waste energy. He tied a fuel canister around himself, and I remember thinking how wrong it was that he was already planning ahead. We hung there for hours, arms hooked over the edge, legs kicking occasionally to keep balance, and when night came, the fear changed shape. During the day, you fear exhaustion. At night, you fear the quiet. By morning, my hands were raw and my shoulders shook, and my mind started lying to me about rescue arriving any moment. He broke the silence calmly and said waiting longer would only weaken us and that the swim was still a chance. I told him the distance was too far now and the current was against us and that it was madness. He did not argue. He just repeated that doing nothing would kill us, and the way he said it made it feel final. When he stood up and adjusted the canister, I felt something drop in my chest because he had already crossed the line where advice matters. He shook my hand firmly like this was a normal goodbye and told me to hold on and that he would get help, and he said it like a promise, even though distance does not care about promises. Then, he turned away and started swimming with strong, deliberate strokes cutting into the water. At first, I could still see him, and his head rose and fell steadily, and I counted strokes without realizing it because counting kept me from thinking. Then the distance flattened him, and then erased him, and the moment he vanished was not dramatic. He simply became too small to exist. I stayed there, gripping the hull alone, listening to the water move around me, and the longer I waited, the more wrong everything felt. Hours later, a flare lit the sky, and rescue came quickly after that with voices and hands and solid surfaces. When they pulled me onto the boat, I kept looking back, expecting him to surface behind me because my mind refused the simplest outcome. When they told me the guides made it to shore, but he never arrived, the words did not land right away. What stays with me is not the cold or the fear or the exhaustion. What stays with me is the image of him swimming away, completely convinced that determination could beat distance, and the understanding that sometimes the thing that pulls you under is not panic but confidence, telling you to keep going long, after the moment to stop has passed. If you want more stories like these, subscribe to Tales of Darkness. Story 2. The Door. He didn't lock. My name is Daniel, and the night this happened did not feel dangerous until I realized how many small decisions had already been made without me noticing. I came home later than usual, and the house felt normal in the way that makes you drop your guard immediately. Lights off the way I always left them. Shoes where they belonged. No sounds that didn't fit. I locked the door out of habit and tossed my keys on the counter, and that was the mistake because I didn't check the back door, and I didn't check the windows, and I didn't notice that the silence felt too settled, like the house had already adjusted to someone being inside. I went straight to the kitchen and poured a drink and stood there longer than necessary because standing still felt safe. That was when I heard a sound behind me that did not belong to an empty house. It was not a footstep, and it was not a voice. It was the soft sound of fabric shifting, like someone adjusting their weight carefully. I froze with the glass halfway to my mouth and listened harder than I ever had before. Nothing followed, and that made it worse because whatever made the sound knew how to stop. I told myself it was the refrigerator or the pipes or my own imagination catching up to me after a long day, and I believed it just long enough to turn around. The living room was dark and empty and looked exactly the way it should, and that calmness made my chest tighten because it meant nothing had moved out of place. I walked through the house, slowly turning on lights room by room, pretending I was just settling in when in reality I was checking angles and corners without admitting it to myself. Everything looked normal until I reached the hallway and noticed the back door was unlocked. I stood there staring at the handle longer than I should have, trying to remember if I had used it earlier, and I could not, and that gap in my memory felt dangerous. I locked it immediately and listened again, and this time I was sure I was not alone. A faint sound came from the bedroom, not loud, not sudden, just the unmistakable sound of someone breathing carefully. I did not call out because something told me not to announce myself. I backed away slowly and reached for my phone and realized my hands were shaking too much to type. The breathing stopped the moment I moved, and that confirmed it. Whoever was inside was listening to me the same way I was listening to them. I moved toward the front door quietly, thinking distance meant safety, and the floor betrayed me with a sharp creak that sounded too loud in the stillness. The response was immediate. Footsteps moved inside the bedroom, fast and deliberate, and I understood that I had just given away my position. I ran then, not thinking, not planning, just moving toward the door because standing still was no longer an option. Before I reached it, something hit me from behind hard enough to knock the air out of my chest. I fell forward and hit the floor, and felt hands grab my shoulders and press me down. The weight was real and close and controlled, and the person did not speak. That silence was worse than shouting because it meant they were focused. I twisted and managed to roll onto my side and saw him for the first time clearly enough to know this was not a mistake. He was already inside my house, and he had been waiting. His face was calm, his movements efficient, and when I kicked and broke free, it surprised him just enough for me to scramble up and reach the door. I unlocked it with shaking hands and threw it open and ran outside barefoot into the night, not caring where I went as long as it was away from the house. I kept running until my lungs burned, and I reached a neighbor's porch and started shouting without words, just noise, just panic. Lights came on, doors opened, and people appeared, and when the police arrived, they went through my house carefully. They found the bedroom window open and footprints on the carpet and nothing else. No weapon, no explanation, no reason. They told me he probably ran when I escaped, and I nodded because I did not want to explain how close it had already been. The worst part came later when I went back inside with an officer and noticed the thing that confirmed it all. The front door lock was scratched deeply on the inside, like someone had practiced unlocking it quietly from the wrong side. That was when I understood he didn't break in that night. He had been there before. He already knew how the door worked. Story 3. He never meant to leave. My name is Michael, and what still confuses people when I tell this story is that nothing was forced at the beginning. No doors were broken. No voices were raised. No moment screamed danger until it was already happening. I met him through work, and that familiarity is what disarmed me, because when someone fits into your routine, your brain stops labeling them as a threat. We talked casually that evening after a long shift, and he mentioned he had missed the last train and asked if he could crash at my place for a few hours. He said it like it was temporary, and temporary things feel harmless. I hesitated just long enough to notice, but not long enough to refuse, and I told him yes because refusing felt awkward, and awkward felt worse than risk. When we got to my apartment, he walked in like he had already been there before, and that detail bothered me later more than it did in the moment. He did not look around with curiosity, he looked around with recognition, like he was checking that nothing had changed. I locked the door out of habit and tossed my keys aside and did not notice the way his eyes followed the movement. We sat in the living room with the lights low and talked about nothing important, and the entire time I felt like the conversation was filling space rather than connecting us. At some point, he asked who else lived there, and when I said no, he nodded slowly and did not respond right away. That pause should have mattered more than it did. He asked where the bathroom was and disappeared down the hallway, and when the door closed, I realized how quiet the apartment felt without another voice filling it. Minutes passed longer than they should have, and I stood up and walked toward the hallway just as he came back. His expression had changed slightly, not angry, not nervous, just focused, like he had finished checking something off a list. He sat closer than before and asked if my landlord lived nearby, and when I said no, he smiled briefly and looked away. I told him he could take the couch and that I needed to sleep because I had work early, and the way his jaw tightened made it clear that this was not what he had planned. He said he just needed to talk a bit more and started asking questions that did not feel casual anymore, questions about how often neighbors were home and whether anyone ever checked on me. Each answer I gave felt like it narrowed my options without me knowing why. When I stood up to go to my bedroom, he followed me without asking and stopped just inside the doorway like he was testing a boundary. I told him again that I needed to sleep and that he should stay in the living room, and this time the silence after my words felt deliberate. He smiled and said, "Of course," and backed away slowly, but his eyes never left me. I closed the bedroom door and locked it, and sat on the edge of the bed listening to the apartment settle around me. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and I started to convince myself I had misread everything. Then I heard the sound of the lock on my door being tested carefully, not rattled, not forced, just turned enough to feel resistance. I held my breath and listened, and the sound stopped immediately like it had never been there. I stayed still longer than felt reasonable, and then heard footsteps move away down the hallway, unhurried and confident. I did not sleep. I waited for morning with my phone in my hand and my body tense. When the light finally changed outside, I unlocked the door and stepped out slowly. The living room was empty. The couch was untouched. The front door was locked. For a moment I thought he had left quietly, and relief almost settled in. Then I noticed the chair by the window had been moved and positioned directly facing my bedroom door. That was when I understood he had not been waiting for sleep. He had been waiting for movement. I left the apartment immediately and did not go back alone. The police found nothing except fingerprints that could not be identified and a bathroom cabinet that had been opened and searched carefully. They told me nothing had technically happened, and that was the sentence that stayed with me because it meant nothing stopped him from trying again. I moved out within a week and changed my routine completely. Months later, I saw him across the street from my new place, standing still and watching the building like he was measuring it. When our eyes met, he did not react. He just turned and walked away slowly like someone who already knew where I lived. Story 4. The voice from the hall. My name is Anthony, and I can tell you exactly when the house stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a trap, because it happened in a second, and it happened quietly. I came home late after a long shift, and the first thing I noticed was the silence felt finished, like the house had already settled for the night without me. I locked the front door and checked it twice, because I had started doing that recently for no reason I could explain, and I went straight to the kitchen and set my phone on the counter and stood there listening like I expected the walls to say something back. Nothing did. I told myself I was tired, and tired people invent problems, and I walked through the living room, turning on one lamp and leaving the rest of the room dark because soft light makes you feel like you are in control. I ate standing up and kept glancing at the hallway, and every time I did, I felt the urge to go check the back door even though I knew I had not touched it. I forced myself not to because I did not want to feed a fear that had no proof. I went to my bedroom and shut the door, and for a few minutes the routine worked and the normal parts of life tried to hold their shape. Then I heard a sound from the hall that did not match the building. It was a single footstep, not rushed, not heavy, just placed carefully like someone testing the floor to see what it would say. I stayed still and listened, and the silence after it felt intentional, like whoever made the sound knew I was measuring it. I told myself it was a neighbor in the corridor outside my apartment because believing that felt easier than accepting the other possibility. Then I heard my name spoken softly from the hallway inside my apartment, and the voice was calm and familiar and wrong in a way I cannot describe cleanly. It sounded like me, but not exactly, like a recording of my own voice played back through someone else's mouth. I did not answer. I held my breath and listened for movement, and heard nothing for a long stretch, and that stretch felt like pressure building. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and the vibration was loud in the quiet, and I hated that it reminded me how far away the phone was, and how much of my apartment existed between me and the front door. The voice said my name again, closer now, and the tone was patient, like it was training me to respond. I got out of bed slowly and moved to the bedroom door and pressed my ear to it. I could hear breathing on the other side, not fast, not panic, just steady, controlled breathing, like someone standing still and choosing not to move. My hand went to the doorknob and stopped because I realized the moment I opened that door, I would be giving the hallway permission. I stepped back and grabbed the only thing within reach that felt like a weapon, a heavy metal flashlight from my drawer, and I held it like it mattered. The voice said my name again, and then said a short sentence that made my stomach drop because it used a phrase my mother used to say when I was younger, and nobody else ever said it that way. The words were simple, and they hit like a hand because they were accurate. I backed away from the door and kept my eyes on it as if it could open by itself. Then the doorknob turned slowly, not jerking, not forcing, just rotating until it stopped against the lock, and the sound was quiet and careful, like someone did not want to alert the neighbors. I realized then that whoever was out there expected my door to be unlocked. I had locked it without thinking, and the lock was the only reason I still had a moment. The knob turned again, slower, and held pressure against the mechanism, like someone listening for a weakness. I raised the flashlight and whispered that I was calling the police, even though I was not sure I could reach my phone without crossing the hall. The voice answered immediately, not with fear, not with anger, but with a calm statement that made my skin go cold because it sounded like it had been waiting to say it. It said, "No, you are not," and then it went quiet again. The silence that followed felt confident. I stayed pressed against the far side of my room, trying to decide whether to run for the window or run for the door, and both options felt like they required a mistake. I heard a soft scrape at the base of the door, like something thin sliding along the floor, and I looked down and saw a shadow shift under the crack. Not fast, not violent, just present. My phone buzzed again on the counter, and the vibration lasted longer this time, like someone was calling, and I understood the worst part, that whoever was in my apartment did not need to rush because time was on their side. The doorknob stopped moving, and for a moment I thought the lock had won, and relief tried to rise. Then I heard the click of metal and the quiet grind of something being inserted into the lock from the outside, and my breath caught because it meant this was not random, and it meant the person had come prepared to open doors quietly. The lock made a small protesting sound, and then a second softer click, and my stomach tightened because the sound was not failure, it was progress. I stepped backward until my knees hit the bed, and I realized I had run out of space. I called out that I was armed, and my voice sounded weak because the apartment swallowed it. The voice answered again immediately, and this time it sounded like my own voice, exactly like it was mocking the idea that a weapon mattered. It repeated the same words I had just said with the same rhythm and the same pause, and then it laughed once softly with no humor. The lock clicked again, and the knob turned, and this time it moved further, and the door opened a fraction of an inch. The hallway beyond was dark, and the crack showed nothing but the edge of shadow. I swung the flashlight beam toward the opening, and the light hit the hall wall and revealed nothing standing there, which was impossible because the door had just moved. I heard breathing again, but it was not in the hall anymore. It was closer than that. It was right outside the door, but slightly to the side, like someone pressed against the wall to avoid the beam. I did not step forward. I kept the light fixed, and my arm started shaking from holding it up, and the shaking made the beam wobble, and I hated that weakness because it was visible. The voice whispered my name again, but now it came from the living room side of the hallway, like the person had moved without making a single floor sound. And that was the moment the fear turned sharp, because it meant I could not track them by noise anymore. I heard my kitchen chair scrape lightly across the floor and then stop, and I pictured someone sitting down calmly in my own kitchen while I stood trapped in my bedroom with a flashlight like it was a solution. The voice spoke from the kitchen in a normal tone, like a conversation had already started. It said, "You can come out now," and the words sounded casual, like I had been hiding during a game. I stayed silent and listened, and heard the smallest sound of a drawer opening and closing, and then nothing. My mind kept jumping to the knife drawer, and I tried not to think of it, because thinking makes images sharper. The voice started talking again, low and steady, and it described my routine in small, accurate details. The time I usually got home, the way I left one lamp on sometimes, the way I always set my phone on the counter before I even take my jacket off. It did not brag. It did not explain. It stated facts like proof, and each fact made the walls feel thinner. I realized then that the worst thing in my apartment was not a weapon, it was attention, and someone had been paying it to me for a long time. My phone stopped buzzing, and the sudden quiet felt like a door closing. The voice said one more sentence, and it sounded like advice given to itself. It said, "Do not move until he moves," and then everything went still. I waited like that for what felt like forever, listening for a mistake that would reveal location, but none came. At some point, I heard the soft sound of my front door opening and closing, and for a second, I thought it was over, and relief tried to make me careless. Then I heard the deadbolt lock from the inside. The sound was sharp and final, and it meant whoever was inside had not left. It meant they had simply changed the rules. I stayed in my bedroom until morning without sleeping, without moving more than I had to, and when daylight finally pushed into the hallway through the window near the living room, the apartment looked the same as always. The door to my bedroom was closed again. The lock was still engaged. The kitchen chair was slightly moved as if someone had sat there. On the counter, my phone was still where I left it. But the thing that confirmed everything was a single small piece of metal resting beside it, a bent key blank, the kind used for copying keys, and it was warm when I touched it, like it had been held recently. I called the police after the sun was up, and they walked through the apartment and found nothing, and said there was no sign of forced entry, and that sentence was supposed to comfort me, but it did the opposite, because it meant the person did not need force. It meant they already had access. It meant they could come back whenever they wanted, and they knew I would hear my name before I ever saw them.